In this tutorial, we'll learn about CSS. While HTML is used to define the structure and semantics of our content, CSS is used to style it and lay it out. For example, we can use CSS to alter the font, color, or size of our elements. We can use it to space our content, split it into multiple columns, or add animations and other decorative features to it. We will transform this page that we built in the previous tutorial into this. Along the way, we will learn about Chrome Developer Tools, one of the most powerful tools every web developer must have under their belt. Let's jump right in. This time around, let's do things a little bit differently though. Let's put up the end result page here to the side as a guide and one by one work our way from our current design to match it. I went ahead and made a few changes to the page that we had at the end of the previous tutorial so we can focus on CSS. I removed the paragraph we had on top here and added the new headings here, here, and here. Let's first change the font of the entire page. To change the font, let's add a new HTML attribute, the style attribute. We briefly touched on attributes in the previous tutorial when we talked about href attribute. Style is another attribute. Inside the style, let's add a font family property and let's give it this value. When we refresh the page, we can see that the font has been updated to the entire page. The body element encloses the content of the entire page, so it makes sense that changing the font at the body element updates the font of the entire page. This is called inheritance, which means whatever style you apply at an element, all elements underneath it, that is, its descendants, inherit the style automatically. Next, let's change the color of the James Bond header here. To do that, let's add a style to the H1 element and let's add a property color and let's set its value to this value. Let's refresh the page and we can see that the header has a new color. I'm sure by now you're wondering, what is this RGB thing? Well, every color in existence is a mixture of three primary colors: red, green, and blue. And this function is saying, I want the red to be this much, I want the green to be this much, and I want the blue to be this much. You don't need to memorize any of these numbers. Just know that each of these components can have a number that ranges from 0 to 255. So if I set the first component here to 255 and set the other components to 0 and 0, we get a red color. Similarly, let's set the second component to 255 and the other components to 0 and 0, and we can see that this gives us a green color as well. Let's set the third component to 255 and the other two to 0 and 0, and no surprise, we get a blue color. And if we set all three components to 0, 0, and 0, we get black. That basically means absence of color. And if we set all three components to 255, 255, and 255, we get white. VS Code has a really handy color picker embedded here, so I can use it to pick the color I want without having to memorize any of these RGB values. Let's actually pick this color here and let's refresh the page and we can see that it's updated. Let's reverse that and get back to the color we intended. Moving on, notice that the header is actually a different font, so let's change it. Let's set the font family property to Georgia and refresh. Our header now matches the end result. You might be wondering, where am I getting those font names and color values? To answer that, let me introduce you to Chrome Developer Tools. To access the Developer Tools, come up to the three dots here, click on More Tools and click Developer Tools. Or there's actually an easier way to do it, which is my preferred way. I would just right click on any empty area of the page here and click on Inspect, and this opens up Chrome Developer Tools. You might also hear me refer to it as Dev Tools. Now let's do this to our end results page here. We have the James Bond header here and we would like to see the styles applied to it. Right click and select Inspect, which opens up the Dev Tools. I want you to move over to the Styles section here. You can see that the H1 has this color, it has this font family, and it has a border at the bottom. And this is where I get these values. Now let's add this line right here underneath the James Bond header. Let's add the CSS property border-bottom. Let's give it the value 1px solid. Let's actually copy the RGB values from here, paste it here. All this means is we want the border to be 1 pixel thick, we want it to be solid, and we want it to be this color, and we want it to be at the bottom only. Let's refresh the page and we see that we have a nice line underneath the header. Now let's compare what we have here to the end result page. We see that all of this information here is contained within this gray box. So let's actually do that next. To do this, I want to introduce you to a new HTML element, the div element. As you can see from the MDN definition here, the div element has no special meaning at all. It represents its values. The div is actually one of the elements you'll see used most out there. That's because it's so versatile and it can behave in many different ways. Here, we want it to behave as a container. Let's move all of the contents in our body underneath the new div. Now let's add a style and use the property background color on the div, and let's use this color value. We got this value from the developer tools of our end result page. Let's refresh. And you can see that now our contents are within this gray box. However, notice that the white part here is so thin compared to our end result. So let's fix that. Let's add a new property, margin. Actually, before I go ahead and do that, let's check the dev tools of our end result here. Let's right click on an empty area of the gray box, click inspect, and we have our styles here. Notice here at the bottom, we have this box. It says margin on the left here, and it says margin on the right as well, and it has the same value. So let's copy those values and let's use them in our margin in the CSS here. Let's add margin left, paste the value, and let's add margin right and paste the value as well. Let's refresh the page and see how that looks. Nice. Now that we can see the white part looks similar to our end result. Although this is not the best way to add margins or any spacing properties for that matter, and let me show you why. Let me grab my browser here and let me reduce its width, simulating a smaller screen. Notice that as the window narrows, the gray part is narrowing, but the white part stays the same. It doesn't adapt to a smaller screen, which is not something we want. Instead, we want all spaces to be proportionate to the size of the screen is viewed from. So, a better way to define margins would be to use a percentage. So let's come up here to our margins and let's change the values to say 10%. And now let's refresh the page and try resizing the window again. Now we see that the white part is decreasing as we shrink the screen, just like the gray part, and everything is proportionate to the screen size. Now, looking at the end result page here, we see that there's a gap here between the header and the edge of the gray box. So let's see how we can do that. Well, actually, before going ahead and implementing that, let's open up the dev tools. And let's look at this box here. We have something that's called padding. It's a gap between the element's border and its inner contents. It's like a cushion. To implement the padding in our page, let's come up to the div element here and let's add the CSS property padding and let's give it 10 pixels. Let's refresh the page and we see that we have a padding here. In this case, we actually want it to be fixed at 10 pixels just because 10 pixels is so small and we want it to be respected across all devices no matter what. What we just discussed, that is margins and paddings, is called the CSS box model. Essentially, every HTML element is considered a box that might have a margin that specifies the distance between it and any adjacent elements, padding that specifies the distance between its border and the contents within it, and a border that surrounds it. Now let's continue on our page and let's compare it with the end result. Notice that underneath the personal information header here, it's a little bit smaller than in our page. So let's see how we can fix this. Let's check the box model of our page here. We can see that the header has 19 margin on top and on bottom. Well, that's because by default, browsers set the default margin to H2 elements. And when we look at the end result, we can see that it has 19 on top and -8 on the bottom. This also teaches us that margins and paddings, they can have negative values. They don't always have to be positive values. So what do negative values do? Well, they shrink the margin or padding. So let's try it out. Let's use an exaggerated value here like -40 and see what happens. We see that the personal information is actually way up. It's way up, we don't even see it. Well, that's because we literally shrunk the margin so much by a negative value that it ends up going up. Let's remove this and let's add -8. And when we look at our page, we see that the margin is actually less and it matches the end result. Okay, moving ahead, we see that the end result page has this gray color on the labels here. Name, date of birth, place of birth. So let's do that. Let's come up here to our strong element. Let's add a style attribute and let's set the color property to this value. Again, we got this value from the dev tools. Actually, let's just do it for the other two as well. When we refresh the page, sure enough, we can see that our labels have these colors. Nice. Moving down, looking at the work header, we see that the gap is so much. Again, let's set it to -8, just like the personal information. Refresh the page. We can see that the margin is actually less now. Making our way down, occupancy and agency, they're in gray, so let's go ahead and update that. When you refresh the page, they're now gray. Next, let's move to the skills header. It has such a big margin, so let's set it to -8. One more thing, in the end result, we see that the heading is actually in red. So let's go ahead and change that. Let's come up to the style here and let's add the property color. This time, actually, let's say red. When we refresh, we see that the skills header is actually in red. This shows us that for color properties, we can actually use names of base colors. We don't always have to use RGB values. Just like the other headers, let's set the margin to -8 for the additional information and let's refresh the page. We see that the gap is shortened now. Now we see that around the signature quote and list of movies, there's a border here. So let's see how we can replicate that. Let's actually look at the border in the box model here. We can see that the border has a value of 2 on all sides. So let's add border with 2 pixels, border style solid, and when we refresh the page there's a border but it's black. So let's go back and add border color, and I'm just gonna paste the RGB values here. And when we refresh the page, we see that we have a border here. I want to take you back to the border bottom of the H1 element here. See how we wrote it? We wrote border hyphen bottom 1px solid in this color. This is a shorthand way of doing it, and browsers are smart enough to know that we mean this is the width, this is the style, and this is the color. Similarly, we can shorthand all of this here by just typing border 2px solid RGB 883196. And when we refresh, we see that we get the same result. Moving on, let's adjust the width of our additional information box here. Let's just add margin right 50%, and when we refresh, sure enough, the box now matches. Again, we use the percentage here because we want it to be dynamic and adapt to different screen sizes. We don't want it to be restricted. Moving on, in the end result, we see that the content within this box is padded, and from the box model here, we can see that the padding is actually 4. So let's go ahead and add padding 4, and when we refresh, we can see that there's a padding here. The final piece is just to add the gray color to these 2 strongs, and we refresh the page. And now our end result and our page match perfectly. This is all good and well, but I would like you to think about something. Let's first zoom out a little bit just so that you can see more code. Let's look at this CSS right here. I want you to think about all the websites you visit every day. How consistent the colors and the themes across all pages. Imagine trying to achieve that consistency like this. It will be a nightmare. It will be nearly impossible. Why? Well, first look at all this duplication. Just because we want all the labels to have this color, we had to do it here, 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 and here. Now imagine having to do this for hundreds of pages. Similarly, you want fonts to be consistent. Imagine having to do this in this page. Imagine having to add font families in every single page that you like. Imagine having to repeat this color like this. There has to be a better way, and there is. And before I show you the better way, let me just show you one thing. Notice when I hover over this style attribute here, it says note that it is recommended for styles to be defined in a separate file or files. This attribute and the style element have mainly the purpose of allowing for quick styling, for example for testing purposes. So we will move all those styles to an external file, but first I want to show you the style element. The style element goes into the head element. Let's create the style element here, and let's see how can we move all these inline styles to become within the style element, starting with the styles of the body element. So let's come up here and type body. That means we're targeting the body element. And let's remove all these styles from here and paste them here, and we don't need this style attribute anymore. And when we refresh the page, we see that everything works the way it was, which is expected. This syntax here, the word body, this is called the CSS selector. It selects what the style applies to. Now let's move on to the div, and you select it in the same way. Again, what this means is whenever you see a div, apply this style to it. Let's select all these styles and remove them to here. Let's refresh the page, and everything works the same way as expected. Next, let's do the H1 element. Again, we use the H1 selector, and we cut all these styles and move them here. And let's remove this, and let's refresh the page, do a sanity check. Everything still works, because all we're doing is removing the styles from being inline within HTML to be within the style element. Next, let's remove this style applied to the H2 element here to within the style element using the H2 selector. Let's refresh and check. Everything still works the same, still matches the end result. We've already added the selector for all of the H2s, so we don't need this here. Let's remove it, and let's refresh the page. No surprises, everything still works the same. Now let's come up here to all of our strong elements and remove the styles from within, and let's add them to the style element. Let's create a strong selector, and let's come up here to our strong element, remove the style color, add it to our CSS selector. It's no longer needed, so let's remove it from here. And actually, let's remove it from all of the strong elements. What I'll do is select this, then press Command C to copy. then press Command F to find, press Command V to paste it, and then without adding anything here, I'm gonna press replace, and this is a trick to remove everything at once. And when we come up to our page and refresh, no changes whatsoever as expected. Now let's take a look at this style here on the skills header. This one is gonna be interesting because we have the margin bottom here, but we also have a color red. So let's copy the color style here and remove the rest of the style because we already have it. And let's go to our existing H2 style and paste the red color here. And let's see what happens when we refresh the page. Now all the H2 headers have a red color, which is obviously not something we want. However, it makes sense that this is the result we got, since here we're saying that for all H2 elements, we want a margin bottom of -8 pixels and we want a red color. To fix this, I want to introduce you to a new type of selector, the class selector. Let's come down here to our skills header and add class skills. Now let's come up to our CSS and add dot skills and paste the color red. And now if we refresh the page, everything is back to the way it was. Okay, so let's step back a little bit. Class here is another HTML attribute, and it allows us to apply styles more selectively. So here, instead of saying all H2 elements should have a color red, we're saying all the elements with the skills class should have a color red. But we still want all H2 elements to have a margin bottom of -8. You can see just how powerful is the class selector. Right, let's keep moving. Here we have the style, margin bottom, -8. Let's go ahead and remove it since we already have the H2 style in the style element. Let's move on to our last paragraph here. And let's first copy all of this style. And let's come up here and add the P selector and paste all of these styles. And let's see what happens when we refresh the page. All of the paragraphs in our page got the border with this padding, which is definitely not what we intended to do. To fix this, let's look at a new type of selector, the ID selector. Let's add the HTML attribute ID equals additional info. To apply the new selector, let's come up here to the P selector and instead use the hash symbol additional info. You target an ID selector by using the hash symbol. Remember earlier we used the dot symbol to target a class selector? Well, here we use the hash symbol. And when we refresh the page, we see that we restored everything to the way it was. You might be wondering, if we have the class selector, why would we use an ID selector? Well, there's a little difference. Class selectors can be repeated, while ID selectors have to be unique within the page. There's another difference between ID and class selectors, and that is ID selectors are more specific than class selectors. This is what's referred to as CSS specificity. If you hover over the additional info selector here, it says selector specificity 100. And if we hover over skills, it says selector specificity 010. And if we hover over the strong, it says selector specificity 001. What this means is additional info, the ID selector is more specific than skills, which is the class selector, which is more specific than the strong, which is a bare element selector. So an ID is more specific, followed by a class, followed by a bare element. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, it means if there is any conflict between selectors, the selector with the highest specificity wins. And let me show you what I mean by this. Let's copy this style here, and let's target the paragraph selector, P. And for the new style, let's use border black. Let's see what happens when we refresh the page. Notice that all paragraph got the black border except this one here, it got the blue border. Why is that? Well, let's look at our CSS here. Additional info is a paragraph also, and this style should apply to it, but it has an ID selector which is more specific than a P selector. So when the browser processes the CSS, it sees that the last paragraph has two styles applied to it, from the ID selector and from the P selector. It knows that the ID selector has more specificity, so that selector wins and the styles from that selector is applied. To make that point clearer, let's come down here to this paragraph and click on developer tools. Here, you see that the styles from the P selector are all crossed out and only the styles from the ID selector, additional info, are applied. This shows you how the browser processes CSS when there is a conflict. And this is what we mean by specificity, and this is how different selectors are applied and used. Let's remove this additional selector and make sure everything's back to normal. Let me give you another example. Here we're saying the skills header has a color red, but let's come up here to the H2 header and add color green to it and refresh the page. we see that all headers have a green color except skillset has a red color, because the skills header has a class selector which has higher specificity than the bare element selector as we've seen previously. Again, let's check the developer tools and we see that it has a .skills selector where the color red is applied, but also the H2 selector is applied to it where there is a margin bottom. However, we see that the green selector is crossed out because for the color the skills selector wins because it has higher specificity. Now let's remove this green color and make sure that we have everything the way it was. I spent a little bit of time on CSS specificity because it's perhaps one of the most important aspects of CSS. Many times you might be working on a solution and you find that your styles are not being applied. After banging your head against the wall for some time, then you come to realize that your styles are not being applied because another more specific selector is being applied. But the developer tools is your friend. This is where you can find what's really happening. There's still one more thing left that we haven't done yet. Let's come up here to our end result. See, when we hover over the word here, the underline disappears. But when we come to our page and we hover over here, nothing happens. Let's see how we can do that. Let's add a new style using the selector A: hover. This hover here is called the pseudo class. And this hover pseudo class allows us to apply styles when an item is being hovered on. So to remove the underline, we need to come up here and say text-decoration none. And if we refresh the page and now hover over the word here, you see that the underline is removed. The reason we delayed this until here is because we simply can't do it inline. And this is one more reason to remove styles from inline. And now we're ready to remove all of our styles into their own separate file, which is the recommended way of doing things. So let's come up here and add a new file and call it styles.css. And let's copy all of our styles here and move them to the new file. We paste them here and we're now ready to remove the styles element. So now let's come up and refresh the page and we see that all of our styling is gone. That's because we didn't tell our index.html file where to find those styles. Let's fix this now. Let's come up here and add a new HTML element, link. The link element requires two HTML attributes. The first one, rel, which is short for relation, basically how this link relates to our file. And here we're going to say style sheet. Next, we're going to use the href attribute to point to the styles.css file. And when we refresh the page, we see that all of our styles are back and they're loaded correctly. Now that we have the styles in their old file, the styles can now be shared. So if you have a website with tens or even hundreds of pages, you can just reuse the styles from page to page by just referencing the styles.css file. And that's how websites achieve the consistency that you see everywhere in the web. This brings us to the end of our tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed it and I hope you followed along. If not, feel free to go back and watch at your own pace and you can try everything on your own. And as usual, I'm gonna leave a link to all the code we used in this tutorial and you can use it as a reference. You can download it, you can play with it, you can try it on your own. If you have any questions or if you have any specific topics you would like me to cover, please leave them in the comments below. And if you found this tutorial useful, you can support the channel by subscribing and by hitting the like button in this video. Thanks for watching.